want to talk to you about your latest book. It's called the Lahore, the Partition Trilogy. It's the first of the Partition Trilogy. So tell us about it. How long did it take for you to write it? Because I don't know, I think I've heard you writing another trilogy before this, which was the Taj Conspiracy and that lady into it, Meronisa, if I'm not wrong.
Nirmisa, yes,
Okay,
yes.
yes. So I remember that. So you are like an expert in trilogy, but I know that writing a trilogy is a lot of patience and a lot of work, a lot of research that goes into your book. So tell us everything that went into Lahore and what should we expect from the forthcoming books.
Right, thank you. So yes, I do have an initial set of trilogy, which is called the Mehrunisa trilogy, which has the Taj Conspiracy, which is book 1, The Hunt for Kohinoor, book 2, and I'm sorry to say I still have to write book 3. So it's a trilogy in progress. Lahore, which is my latest book and is my 7th book, is part 1 of what we're calling the Partition trilogy. And how did Lahore come about? It's actually, I think the idea has, in a sense, been germinating since I started writing. So it's like a 2-decade journey, really. I started my writing in the turn of the millennium, 2001, when, we had just moved to Singapore from Bombay. And I had been, I had a corporate career, which was very hectic. I was working in consulting and marketing and sales. And so I decided to take a sabbatical. And this was in Singapore, which in 3 weeks, I was without anything to do. The house was set up and I just felt like, the stirrings of a story within me. And really all the writing I had done was PowerPoint presentations. So I said, okay, let's just, go with it. And to cut a long story short, really that short story became a long story. And then I realized that I needed to spend more time researching and trying to understand. And the reason for that is that I grew up in a border town, which is smack on the border between India and Pakistan. It's called Firozpur. And it was a Muslim majority town. And so by the laws of India's partition, it should have gone to Pakistan. But it didn't. It stayed within India, and it is a large cantonment town, which means a large army base. And so I grew up with stories, practically every household had a story of partition to tell. And, you're a child, you don't really pay attention because it's part of the air you breathe, part of the furniture around you. But then during my adolescence is when the Sikh militancy started. And I saw it very closely because one, we were on the border, and the police was alleging that a lot of the militants would actually flee across the border to Pakistan. So Firozpur got a new sort of tag name. It was called the militant hotbed. And my father was a criminal lawyer. So we saw it very closely because he would have people come from the villages to him and say that our son got plucked up in the night and can you come help file a writ petition, for that. A bit like the film Marches by Gulzar Saab, if anybody has seen. It was very much, I saw it live. And once again, you are an averagely good student, academics is what you're really concerned about. So I moved out of Firozpur, I did my engineering, went to IIM Calcutta, had a corporate career. And then in Singapore is when, sort of Firozpur came alive for me again. And I worked on a novel. I taught myself writing because I had never really done any writing. And that novel, it's called The Long Walk Home. It came out in 2009. So it was a very, very long journey. But what it did was it taught me the things that I had seen growing up, never understood. Because to write that initial short story, The Long Story and Long Walk Home, which really explores the turbulent 20th century history of Punjab through one family. And I had to therefore understand why the Sikh militancy had happened. Why did partition happen? So I, went all the way back. And really after that, to sort of distract myself from the heavy research and the sort of writing about a time period which was very poignant and turbulent, I went to the Mehrunisa trilogy, which is again a woman, who is solving mysteries, but she is not a James Bond or a Jane Bond. She's a regular Indian woman. And I wanted to show how a woman can be herself and still do exciting things with life. And after that, I had done that, written 2 books, and then we moved to New York again on my husband's job, which was another huge sort of disruption because while I love the city, you have to do everything yourself. It's very much, I was telling my husband, ki budhape mein I have to learn how to run the washing machine and things like that. But when I was here, it was, I'm living in Manhattan, and you get into a yellow cab, and most of them tended to be Sikh cab drivers or Pakistanis, a few Bangladeshis. And then there's a large expat community of Desis. When I say Desis, it's really the entire subcontinent: India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, some Nepalis, in New York City. And I quickly started to realize that they were kind of subterranean. They were seen but not seen. And the reason for that is that there's a huge gulf between them. The really smart ones are in Wall Street, and everybody considers them the model minority. And then there is these brown-faced men, the ones who wear turban were considered Arabs, because Americans don't know what a Sikh is, that there is a religion like a Sikhism. And the other brown people are just considered Middle Eastern. And then I started to hear stories about 9/11 and what had happened after that. And most people don't know that the first victim of violence, anti-hate violence, sort of Arab violence, was a Sikh man in Arizona who was shot because the white American, thought he was an Arab. And I'd always heard stories, even when I was back home in India and Singapore, Hong Kong, and I had the stirrings of an idea again about how the violence of 47, which got repeated in 1984 during the anti-Sikh pogrom in Delhi and other parts of India. And I was still seeing it here because I was meeting people, especially women, who had fled after 84. A lot of them were immigrants, unregistered, didn't have any, their visas had lapsed, and he was staying on and he was working in households and, as staff in hospitals, in hotels. And I thought I wanted to understand.
US,
in the US, yes, very much so. And a lot of them were afraid to go back because they had basically, like in 47, they had fled for India. In 84, they had fled out of India again to come to the US. And then, out of that came The Radiance of a Thousand Suns, which is my fifth novel. It released in 2019. And then I wrote Girls in the City, which is again a fun look at a group of girls in Bangalore, young working professional women. And I want to see how women, tackle this everyday misogyny, patriarchy in their own way, and how sorority, women do help each other out. Women are there for each other. And I wanted to bring that out in the friendships that women have, they cultivate. And this was also written at the time of the Me Too movement, where I felt in India, we had a conversation and then it just suddenly died down. And I wanted to reignite that. So after that came Lahore. And as I said, Lahore had always been with me because I had been working on the partition theme for a while. But I decided I was finally ready to tackle this part because what I wanted to do with Lahore was, it is set in the 9 months leading up to the independence and partition of India. Mm-hmm. So it starts in February and comes up to September 1947. And I wanted to do two things with it. I wanted to put on the same stage the political leaders in Delhi who are taking decisions, which is, so I have as my primary protagonist in the Delhi thread, Vallabhbhai, who's called Vallabh because that's his first name, Jawaharlal Nehru, whom I call Jawahar, and Lord Mountbatten, who is Dickie Mountbatten. So as these men are taking the decisions, I also wanted to show what is happening in Lahore, which was the cultural capital of Punjab, and Punjab was one of the states which was partitioned. And as the rumors are gathering, what are people doing? What are they thinking? What's the confusion? And for the first time, really, I wanted to put both of them on the same stage because I think it's important for us as Indians to realize that the decisions taken by the leaders did not come easy. They were dilemmas, they were challenges, they were tackling on a daily basis as the charger of time was galloping towards 15th August, and how it was impacting the Aam Aadmi and Aurat in Lahore. Because that's the other thing I wanted to do. When partition happened, the violence that erupted was really violence which was carried out on women's bodies. Women were the ones who were assaulted. Women were the ones who were sexualized. Women were the ones who were killed. Of course, men died, but men turned upon each other. And I wanted to capture that. I wanted to bring not just women as victims, but women as women who lived their lives, who loved, and who lived through that cataclysm. And I wanted to show those women. So I wanted to bring them out of the sort of interstices of history where otherwise women are hidden. If you look at the stories of independence and partition, it's really independence that we celebrate, and rightly so, but we never talk about partition. And partition, is considered the largest human migration in modern history. 15 million people migrated east-west within a period of 4 months. And the violence was also horrific because we had 1 to 3 million dead. So where are those stories? When I would read our history textbooks or, some of the partition literature, that was about it. But nobody was really speaking about the multiple stories, for instance, that I had witnessed, that I heard when growing up. And so it was my intention. I said, I will now, with all the research that I have done, I will really sit down and start tackling the books. So book 1 is Lahore, book 2 is Hyderabad, and book 3 is Kashmir, and they will release in 22 and 23. And the reason I'm talking about Hyderabad and Kashmir is because these were the 2 large princely states, which at the time of India's independence was still not integrated. See, that's the other thing. Most people think that the British left.
New knowledge for me.
Yeah, most people think. So, yeah.
Maybe the second book would be Delhi or maybe.
No, let me bring you up to date. Most people think that independence happened. India gave Pakistan away. That's something we hear all the time. And the British left India and Pakistan. And that is so false. It is so flawed. When the British were leaving, World War II had bankrupted Britain. And Attlee, who was the new prime minister of the Labour government, was very keen to wash his hands off India and quit, which was partly because they had been bankrupted, and second, because the World War had exposed the hypocrisy of British rule in India, right? I mean, they were rebelling against, they went to war with Germany, but what were they doing with us in India? So the British could not wait to just quit India and flee. They came up, so they were doing a lot of formulas to sort of satisfy the Muslim League, keep the Congress, which is the main party, also going. And people don't realize that India had 565 princely states. Now, the princely states were not directly governed by Britain, but they were under the overall purview. They were more considered as partners. So these 565 princely states were scattered all over India. And the British came up with a plan called Plan Balkan, in which there would be a Hindustan, a Pakistan, and a Princesstan. Wow. So there was 40% of Indian landmass, which was the princely states, which would sort of be left floating, like, holes in sort of the body of India that we see today.
Maybe like Europe in a way.
But Europe, at least, you have, in India, it would have been like, okay, so you had, let's say, currently what we see as the state of Madhya Pradesh. So if you take Madhya Pradesh and then punch 12 holes in it, you would have these princely states sitting within that. So the states were not they were large, they were small, like Hyderabad and Kashmir.
Geographically not connected even.
Not connected. So the India we would have would be, like I have a character in the novel, say, it'll be like mutton in the curry of India. Like we have these bone pieces sticking out of the curry of India.
But you just said about Madhya Pradesh is also very interesting. Like it would be like like a hole
punched
in the state, right?
And not just MP. This would be all the states.
All over, yeah.
All of them. It would be punch holes.
Like that, yeah.
And then imagine trying to run a country where every 12 miles there is a prince who is like, no, I have my borders. You can't come in. Rules, I have my own legal system, my own constitution, right? So that was a nightmare that was facing Jawaharlal Nehru and Vallabhbhai Patel when the British came up with this plan. So what was done was an immense effort. Within less than 2 months, the Ministry of States, which was newly created with Vallabhbhai as its head, worked very hard with VP Menon and Jawaharlal Nehru and other comrades to get the princes to accede to India. So at the time of independence, and when the clock struck 15th August, there were 2 states, large states, which were remaining. They had not integrated. There was another one called Junagadh, which I tackled, but Junagadh gets resolved very quickly. And both Kashmir and Hyderabad were converse of each other. Hyderabad was a large Hindu majority state with a Muslim Nizam at the head. In Kashmir, it was a large Muslim majority state with a Hindu ruler at the head. And both of them were like, we aren't joining you. And both were very rich, fabulously wealthy states. The Nizam was considered the richest man in the world at that time. So I see the story of Hyderabad has been forgotten. Yes. People don't even know that this had happened. That on September 1948 is when Hyderabad finally acceded or was integrated into India. It's a fascinating story because the communists were very strong in
Hyderabad. After a year of independence, when you're saying 48?
Yes.
1 year, it was...
1 year and 1 month. So, and the communists were very strong as well. The Nizam himself was strong. He had Razakars who were very militant. How did that happen? So once again, the thread is in Delhi and in Hyderabad. Okay. And in Kashmir, you know, the story, the saga continues to this day.
Even today.
Even today. And most people think they know everything about Kashmir, but actually they don't. So in Kashmir, again, I'm trying to capture what happened in those 12 months after 15th August 1947. How did we reach the place where we are today? So that is the attempt with those two books.
And that's a lot of, that's the story I think most of the Bollywood movies would probably focus, because whenever we talk of partition, we have this Kashmir and Lahore and, you know, so that is probably a story a lot of people are still familiar with, or let's say people know about, but Hyderabad would be like completely different, I would say. And the fascinating part is you got all these ideas or inspiration by meeting people in the US, ladies in the US who had migrated after 84. So did you have like long conversations with them? Did you get the stories? Because it's so fascinating that you have to travel thousands of miles away from your country to actually know your country better. In fact, even I feel it personally, after I moved out of India, I am like now more fascinated about India, and I relate to India's story in the global scenario. I mean, like you said, the World War, I never thought that World War II and Indian independence was like so interconnected, so to speak, but that's fascinating. So tell me about your research process. I mean, all of this, what you're saying sounds not something that you could have found out in internet, I'm sure.
So, just a minor. So yes, moving to the US was a big help because, as I said, I was meeting the diaspora and the diasporic stories about what had happened. But that added to my desire again to go back to telling the stories of partition. But, you know, in terms of research, so there are two things. One is the oral history research, you know, which is talking to people. And in fact, during writing my first book, The Long Walk Home, I had realized that when I went looking for research material, there is some stuff which is dry and factual in the books, but all those vivid stories, you know, I had heard whilst growing up, I didn't have. So what I started doing was every trip back to India, and I made some specifically for the purpose of research, I would sit down and talk to women, talk to people and write, make notes, make copious notes. Because I also realized that these people, that was the last generation which had seen 47, that they would be passing on, and a lot of them have. And then the research into 1984, the pogrom which had happened in Delhi, which was again very challenging because, again, most people are not aware, but there is
Operation Blue Star, you mean, right?
Yes, Blue Star. When Blue Star happened, and then what we call in India 1984 riots. I refuse to call them riots because riots assume two things. They assume there is premeditated violence on both sides. And in this case,
the government.
This was purely violence committed on the Sikhs who lived in Delhi. And most people don't know, but in Delhi, there exists in East Delhi, in Vikaspuri, a colony called Widows Colony. And in this colony are housed women and children of all the men and all the families which were massacred, killed, and looted during 1984. Now, those children are obviously grown up. And a lot of them are women because any boy above the age of 8, 9 was massacred. So these are stories we don't talk about. Nobody knows that. And researching into it was very tough because a lot of these women are traumatized. And when you speak to trauma victims, the first response is, why do you even want to bring it up? Nobody's going to help me. I have buried it away. So that is one part of the research, which is the oral part. And then there is, of course, just, you know, going to libraries, going through the archives, dipping into material, reading, making notes. And I have to say, I am very, very thankful that all the places I lived in, and I started with Singapore, which has a national library, then Hong Kong Public Library, and now in New York, the New York Public Library, excellent library networks, and really committed to supporting writers and researchers. For instance, in New York during the pandemic, you know, I was stuck at home. Lahore was written, but I was writing my next book, and you know, I had still to write Hyderabad and still to write Kashmir, and so I spoke with the New York Public Library, and they are so wonderful. They started a new program for people like me who are researching and writing and coming to the library on a regular basis, and they enrolled us in that, and then the books we would ask for would be delivered home. So they were sent home to me. And also, the New York Public Library is connected to the library networks at some of the Ivy League universities, so Princeton, Yale, Columbia. So I can actually ask for books which may not be in the NYPL archive, but they can get it from there. I was given access to digitized digital files as well. So it was extraordinary. And I really needed it because a lot of times the books that I'm seeking, there will be like one copy, somewhere. And I remember once I was, so before the pandemic, I wanted to read a particular book. It's by a guy called Conrad Corfield, who basically was heading the princely states administration from the British before partition. So he was very, very, very hostile to the idea of the princely states getting integrated into India. He was like, there should be a Princestan. They should decide what they want to do. They should decide whether they want to be independent or make a little confederation or join Pakistan. He was of that view. But anyway, I wanted to get his insight, and I requested for that book. And it was a book there's just one copy available. And I went to the public library in New York. There's a special research room where you go. So the package was brought out to me. So there's a big box, you open it, and then, but then it's covered with all this parchment, lined linen paper, so that no, those
dust or
flies and all can get into it. There were 3 layers, and then the book came out. So it's like 180 pages long.
Okay.
And it was published sometime in 1948 or something. And it's just one copy they have.
Wow.
So, but otherwise, how do I know what is happening? So my research process is humongous. It's deep. I spend a lot of time over it. But once the research is done, you have to tell a story. Yeah. It's a narrative, right? People have to.
Then it's a fiction. Then it turns into fiction, right?
Yeah. Then. But what I
converted them into some fictional guys, or you have kept them like really. Are they real characters, or have you fictionalized aspects of, let's say, Jawaharlal Nehru and Sardar Patel and the families of the migrants? Have you like fictionalized them to?
So what I use is it's an approach called critical fabulation, and it's developed by an American writer called Saidiya Hartman. And what really means is that the skeleton of your narrative has to be absolutely bound in research and hard facts.
Factual.
But then you have to put the flesh on it. So in terms of the Delhi thread, what I'm doing is I am bringing those leaders whom otherwise we just see, on portraits hanging on our walls, or we will see them in a statue. I'm making them flesh and blood characters. So I'm fictionalizing them in the sense that I'm bringing them alive, but there is nothing that I speak about them or that I have them say or in their relationships, which is not based in fact.
Okay.
Every single thing is rigorously researched. So I bring Indira Gandhi. She's Hindu there. She's not the formidable Indira Gandhi that we know. Right. She is Jawaharlal Nehru's young daughter, newly married with 2 little sons, and she's helping run his home because he's a widow.
Still 1948.
48, yes.
48, right?
Yes. So, and the Aam Aadmi in Aurat in Lahore. This is again based on a lot of research, oral interviews. But what I've done is I have taken, let's say, characteristics of 2-3 people and put them in one person, because there I have that liberty, because I'm not saying this is person X who lived in Lahore at this time. They are entirely out of my imagination.
Correct.
But what I'm saying is it's all based on actual things that happen, actual events that happen. So my attempt with this book is that young people, or even older people who pick it up, should say, oh, I can get to know the history of India. I can get to know that period by reading this book.
Excellent. Amazing. So I had to keep asking you questions while you were responding, because I was just so fascinated to hear the whole plot and the story of your book. So yeah, cool. So I'm really looking forward to your other 2 books in this trilogy. Now tell me about one of the first books that you have written, because that is the one that I remember reading. It was your own experience. I think the Earning Laundry Stripes.
Earning the Laundry Stripes.
Earning the Laundry Stripes. So I really found it very fabulous. So tell us about your growth as a person and as an author from that book till now, because it's probably completely different, Manpreet, am I right? As far as an author is concerned, because if I think of that book, it's probably really stories from your life, what you had been through in your internship, and a lot of us can relate to it because we also had similar lives. So tell
Yeah.
us about your growth as an author and a person from that book to what you're doing right
No,
now.
I'm glad you reminded me because, as I said, The Long Walk Home, which is my first book that I started writing, is my second published.
Yeah.
So my first book, which got published, is called Earning the Laundry Stripes, and that is based off my own experience working as a lone woman in Hindustan Lever, which is now Unilever India, as a sales manager. First as a sales trainee, and then as a sales manager. And when I joined Unilever, I had a fabulous time. Fabulous in the sense, in hindsight, it was so full of drama because I was learning so much. I was in the field where people had never seen a woman before. And
And this
therefore,
was
there
like
was,
90s, right? Or
yeah, I joined in 93 after completing my MBA from IIM Calcutta. So I was recruited off campus and I joined then, and they had women in the chai business, Lipton, Brook Bond, but not in what we call the sabun tail business, which is detergents. And I was in upcountry Gujarat, and I was in Bombay Metro. And I remember it was just an extraordinary time because I would go to Bhindi Bazaar, which is sort of this big wholesale market in Bombay. And I remember, my sales officer introducing me as this is going to be the sales manager. And the men would be sitting there and their eyes would open. But they were all very, very supportive. In fact, I remember one of them said, Madam Indira Gandhi bhi aise hi shuru hui thi. When I would go back home, there was so much to process at the end of the night about the things I was seeing and doing and people I was meeting. So obviously there you are on a treadmill, you're running from day to day. So when I was writing The Long Walk Home, and as I said, I was teaching myself to write, I had taken on such a big project, historical fiction, 100 years of Punjab's history. And my husband was like, why don't you give yourself a break? Try, in the midst of those several drafts I was doing in 2006, he said, give yourself a break.
So it was while you were working, you wrote your first.
No. I had quit work. I was in Singapore and I had decided that I would become a full-time writer. This is my husband will say, this is a very Manjeet Sodhi style. Once she's got it in her head, she's not going to listen to anything else. Thankfully, our daughter came along at the same time. So my writing and my motherhood journey sort of parallel each other. And they also gave me a reason to be at home with my child and write.
Absolutely.
And both of them sound very romantic, but both were big struggles. Because I remember in my early days, my daughter was a very light sleeper. She would wake up and then I would take her in my arms and I would have her in my lap like this and I would be writing like this.
Oh, God.
And she knows this so well because I've told her the story repeatedly.
I can imagine doing that actually.
So I wrote Earning the Laundry Stripes. And once I had the idea about the story, I said, obviously it's fictionalized. It's not one likes to believe that one leads very exciting lives, but that's not like it. Yeah. But there were a lot of moments of realization, of empathy, of shock, of drama. So I said I would weave all those into the life of Noor Bhalla, who's my protagonist in Earning the Laundry Stripes. And the book did very well. In fact, in 6 months, I had an offer from Bollywood.
Wow.
But in the nature of Bollywood, things sort of just, they sputtered and they died. And the person, I know him now, he keeps thinking of reviving the project. And we had thought, Priyanka Chopra was very new at the time. And she was slotted to be Noor Bhalla, for instance. But what I have done when I look at my writerly journey, now I have 7 books. I like to write across genres. One, because I don't believe in genres. I read across genres. I read for entertainment. I read for pleasure. I read for how the language makes me think, how it delights me. So I read for a variety of reasons. And similarly, I don't feel that I have to be, Manjeet has to be this serious writer or she's a commercial writer.
Research-based writer.
Yeah. So I write. So that's why if you look, Earning the Laundry Stripes, then Girls in the City, which came out last year.
In the same.
Yeah, there are books about young women forging their way in sort